911, what's the address of your emergency? My friend called me, and he's like laying there with a bunch of blood. He's not breathing.
He's not breathing?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
They find him laying on the ground. They quickly realize that this was a major crime that had occurred.
I was just trying to think of who it could have been that killed my brother.
We discovered that there were several cameras that showed in the last moments of the deceased's life.
And that's where leads started breaking for this case. Now we have a fugitive essentially on the run.
We have him on video at 3 different locations. The whole shooting is on video.
"20-year-old Gabriel Perez is on his way to hang out in the park with his sister and niece.
Hey, Lisa!
Hey!
Is that my favorite niece?
That's Uncle! Hi, Uncle! Whoa!
Gabriel was really goofy.
Hi! Hey!
Where's there?
How's my favorite niece, huh?
Just outgoing and loving with everyone, anyone and everyone. Just enjoying life, you know, going out, having parties.
Oh, you're having so much fun, aren't you?
He loved my daughter.
The kitty? What kitty?
He was the fun uncle as well.
Do you want to go higher, Bunny?
Gabriel was just really nurturing with her.
He always cared, like, if he saw you down in the dumps, he would say something really goofy to get you back up and going.
You're hanging with your skater buddies this weekend?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna go to a party with Marianne.
The last time I saw Gabriel, we went to the park and we hung out.
Go, Alphas.
If I would have known that that would have been the last time I actually seen Gabriel in person, I would have told him that I loved him.
What? I never would think, you know, something like this could happen.
I got a party to go to, but catch you guys there.
Bye. Take care.
What's the address of your emergency? My friend called me and said that he fell on his skateboard and he was at McDonald's on me. And I'm over here, and he's like laying there with a bunch of blood, and
Okay.
you know, his eyes are open. He's not breathing.
He's not breathing?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
The paramedics are on the way there, okay?
I'm so scared.
A 911 call came in indicating that a male had been injured, that he's bleeding. And until officers arrived on scene, they discovered something much worse had happened. They find him laying on the ground by the sidewalk in front of McDonald's. The 911 caller was with him. They assessed his injuries. They quickly realized that this was a major crime that had occurred.
The injured person is Gabriel Perez.
First responding officers began life-saving efforts. But he was pronounced deceased at the scene. By the time I arrived on scene, officers had cordoned off the area. We see he's got multiple apparent gunshot wounds.
Mr. Perez was shot 3 times. One of the bullets went through his heart, and that's what killed him.
The first thing I wanted to do was speak with the 911 caller, who was identified as Marianne Delgado.
Detective Hansen, Detective Jonas.
Fargo PD. Let's talk inside.
She was the only person on scene that knows the victim in this case.
Where were you and Gabe earlier this morning?
We were at a party.
She explained that the two had met up and went to a house party in South Fargo.
Was there any trouble at this party?
I don't think so. I left around 1.
She went back to Moorhead, Minnesota, and left Gabriel Perez back at this house party. Perez starts sending her several messages, and Perez wants her to come back. He wants a ride.
He said, "Yo, where are you at?" I said, "Moorhead." He said, "Can you come pick me up?"
What time was that at?
4:24.
Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts, increasing in urgency. Around 5 a.m., Gabriel Perez sends her his last message.
"Please come and get me. I fell so effing hard and I'm bleeding bad."
What time?
5:21.
When she got there, she found out what state he was in and called 911. I started assessing the scene. I did a walkthrough of it. We see evidence of a shooting. There's bullet impact marks in the sidewalk and in the concrete in the parking lot, on the facade of McDonald's. 145 caliber casing was found on scene. So one of the questions is, where are the other casings?
Get forensics, have them comb the area, see if there's any more casings. Yeah.
Gabriel Perez's cell phone was located near his body. We wanted to see if that had any location information to show his whereabouts leading up to his death.
Get a warrant for Gabe's cell phone. See who else he spoke to before he was shot.
Investigators give Gabe's family the news.
This one too. I got a call from my mom.
Hey, Mom.
And she was crying. She ended up blurting out that Gabriel's dead. I remember just dropping on the floor. I just couldn't process any of it.
I hear loud banging on my door. And my dad comes in, and then he told me, and I'm like, Like, are you joking with me? Because it just didn't seem real.
My phone starts ringing. And it's my brother telling me, hey, they found Gabriel dead at McDonald's. Tears were running down my face. And it feels like my rib exploded. I can't even breathe.
There are no witnesses to the crime, so investigators pin their hopes on surveillance footage.
We quickly realized McDonald's had multiple cameras.
Okay, this one right here, this is gonna give us some good footage. We're gonna have this area covered.
It was very fortunate, in a sad way, that this shooting happened outside of McDonald's because there were several cameras pointed directly at the area of the shooting.
Excuse me, you the manager? I need to see your surveillance footage.
They have 2 cameras that covered the side of McDonald's where Gabriel Perez was shot. Camera 15 is pointing towards the south and the east, and that covers part of Main Avenue going towards the east of McDonald's.
Spin it from 5 a.m. Stop. That's him. Play that again.
We can see Gabriel Perez arrive at about 5:20 a.m.
Zoom in from there.
It's at about 5:21 a.m. You can see Gabriel appears to be using his cell phone.
That's when he texts Marianne Delgado.
He was messaging Miss Delgado to tell her to come pick him up, and had told her that he had slipped and fallen on his skateboard. From what you could see in the security footage, he looked uninjured.
We don't know if he did fall off his skateboard or if he was just trying to get Delgado to hurry up and get over to McDonald's. He then sits down on the curb. The next thing we see is a black SUV come flying into the parking lot.
The vehicle immediately approaches Perez, stops.
Gabriel Perez looks up to see who stopped abruptly right in front of him and immediately stands up and starts running to get away from this vehicle. We don't know why.
That kid looks scared.
The vehicle speeds out of the parking lot and then drives eastbound on Main Avenue.
We need a better look at that vehicle.
You have a camera facing the other way. Can we see that one?
The McDonald's restaurant had multiple cameras.
On this camera, Gabriel Perez sits down, just out of frame.
On the west-facing camera, we could see the vehicle enter the parking lot.
Stop. Play that again.
At 5:23 a.m., we could see the vehicle stop right in front of Gabriel Perez.
Zoom in.
The driver reaches across his body with his right hand. You can see a pistol in his hand. And he fires downward at Gabriel Perez. You can see the recoil from the gun as multiple shots are fired.
He's point blank shooting at the kid.
Perez runs away as far as he can before he collapses to the ground. The actions depicted in the McDonald's footage very clearly identified that the person who pulled that trigger was acting with an intent to kill.
Is that a white male?
Maybe black hair.
You could see that it was a man. You couldn't make out his features exactly, but you could tell that he was wearing some sort of gray shirt.
We really need to ID this vehicle.
Let's go back to the first angle.
Stop. Play that one more time.
We slowed it down, watched it several times, trying to identify what make and model that vehicle is.
That's a Chevy.
It appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. There was no license plate visible on the vehicle.
What's that on the rear windshield?
The video wasn't crystal clear, but we could see the vehicle had unique stickers that we keyed in on. There's one on the rear windshield. And there was also another sticker that stood out that was on the rear driver's side door. So we put a bolo out for law enforcement within the whole metro area to be on the lookout for this vehicle.
Next, investigators retrace Gabe's movements to find out what he was doing in the hours before his death.
Delgado told us that she picks up Gabriel Perez and they go to this house party with people that Delgado knew. So the next question was, did anything occur at this party that led to Gabriel Perez's death? Delgado said the people that were at the house party were a friend named Devin and Devin's boyfriend, Ryan. We speak with them.
Hey, this is Detective Hansen from Fargo PD.
What we learned from those interviews was that
you actually suck at this game.
Gabriel Perez showed up. He was hanging out with them. And at one point in the night, he receives some messages. And it seemed like it was possibly something concerning to Gabriel Perez, whatever conversation that he was having over his phone, but they didn't know who he was communicating with. Devin went to bed, and Gabe and Ryan were still up playing video games at the house. Eventually, Ryan went to bed while Gabe was still there. Next day, they wake up, and Gabriel was no longer there.
Okay.
No one really knew where Gabe was going when he left that night. He just left.
We wanted to know, who was Gabriel talking to? What would be concerning in his life? Why did Gabriel go to McDonald's at that time in the early morning hours? We wanted to establish not only his timeline of when he left that house party, but the specific route he took to get to McDonald's. We have a vehicle identified as a suspect vehicle. Is Gabriel Perez being followed by this vehicle along those routes? So it was important for us to find any and all video of Gabriel Perez's route. We looked at surveillance video from a traffic cam on 13th Avenue and South University Drive.
Spool it from 4 a.m.
Sometime after 4 a.m., Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts telling Delgado he needs a ride. He arrived at McDonald's at 5:20 a.m., so that's the time frame we want to grab this video from.
Look.
That's him.
The traffic cam at University and 13th Avenue showed Gabriel skateboarding at 5:09 a.m.
We could see in that video that Gabe was traveling alone, and he was traveling north.
It's pretty much just him on the street by himself. Watching this video of Gabriel Perez en route to McDonald's, nothing stood out as concerning.
So at that point, the suspect vehicle was still at large, and we had no identified person associated with the shooting.
Across the state line in Moorhead, Minnesota, Gabriel's family is in shock following his murder.
It's heart-shattering, you know? Like, you don't know what to do in that situation. What can you do?
Police can only do so much, but we wanted more to be done. We wanted to know who it was.
Gabe's family was very upset about what had happened, and they took it upon themselves to start solving the crime.
In Gabe's bedroom, the family finds a crucial piece of evidence.
My brother calls and says, hey, I found a phone number. It's not gonna get you nowhere is what I told my brother. It's probably nothing. But he proceeded it and called it anyway.
Hello?
Hello? This is Gabriel Perez's uncle?
There's a frantic woman on the other side of the line, and she just starts bawling, saying, Gabriel's dead because of me. It's my fault he's gone.
Hold on. It's okay. Stay on the line.
He's trying to calm her down, try to get more information.
I want to help you.
Then she hangs up. At that point, I'm shocked, and like I told him, if it's a Minnesota number, a Moorhead number, she has to live close.
Yeah.
Approximately 6:40 p.m., we receive a phone call from the uncles of Gabriel Perez.
And what did she say?
They spoke with a female. This female implied that she had knowledge that Gabriel Perez was dead. She was expressing guilt over his death.
She didn't identify herself at that point.
What was that number?
But we knew this number connects to somebody that's going to get us directly to the killer.
Run this.
So we have that phone number ran through the Fargo police records.
Okay, thank you. Any hits?
Looks to be a VO number.
Turns out that phone number was actually a voice over IP number ran by a company called Text Now.
I'm gonna call the DA and we're gonna get a subpoena.
So I submitted an emergency disclosure to Text Now. to identify who this woman is.
Just 20 minutes later, investigators received news of another potential breakthrough in the case.
Moorhead police called us and said they located a black SUV that appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. So this case is now moving at an extremely fast pace.
The vehicle itself matched the broad description of what was seen on the McDonald's video.
This vehicle was parked in an apartment complex. Black Chevy Trailblazer, no license plate.
There was a sticker on the back of the vehicle which had been partially peeled off.
That sticker that we could see on the surveillance video from McDonald's had been removed. However, they did a poor job at removing it. It was apparent it was the same vehicle.
Well, what do we got here?
There's actually a fired cartridge casing on the outside of the front windshield, right by the windshield wipers. And it's a .45 caliber casing, consistent with the one we found at the scene. And my thoughts are, what are the odds? We then obtained a search warrant and subsequently searched the vehicle. One of the things that was found is a receipt.
See that?
And it's an ATM withdrawal receipt.
From Vision Bank in Fargo, we could see that there was a time and a date stamp. September 22nd at 9:04 p.m. The night that Gabe was killed.
So my next step is I went to Vision Bank and obtained a subpoena requesting that they provide me with any surveillance video the bank has to see who was withdrawing that money at that time.
While investigators wait for the ATM footage, they receive a report on the number that was found in Gabe's bedroom.
Hey, I got a name to match that number.
Shortly after midnight, TextNow gets back to us. I start looking through TextNow's data, which identifies the subscriber as Izetta Cooley.
Detectives run a background check on Izetta. She's a 39-year-old mother of 7.
Izetta Cooley and her husband have multiple children together. They reside in Moorhead. Now we have a big decision on our hands. How do we try to reach out to Izetta in a way that's not going to precipitate further violence? What we decide is we can't risk reaching out until we knew more information.
Why don't you pull up her social media?
Initially, we didn't see any direct link to Gabriel Perez. He's like 20 years old at the time, closer to the age of Izetta Cooley's oldest children.
Investigators analyze Gabriel's Facebook records.
I saw on September 20th, he friended Izetta Cooley. And we can see some Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel Perez. Looking through those messages, initially, Izetta sent Gabriel messages saying she was looking for her daughter, and quickly, Gabriel Perez turns a message to Izetta saying how he thinks Izetta was attractive. And that appeared to spark conversations back and forth that read pretty flirtatious between the two of them.
Through the course of the next several days, Izetta and Gabe keep talking.
On September 21st, Gabriel seemed to initiate trying to coordinate a time to meet, that the two were going to be romantic with each other. And then a few hours before the murder, the messages drastically change. Izetta's messages about meeting up with Gabriel appeared to be increasing in urgency.
Izetta reached out to Gabe to set up a meetup. at the McDonald's restaurant in that morning.
She's setting up the meet.
Within minutes of him arriving, Gabe reaches out to Izetta and tells her, "I'm here at the McDonald's."
2 minutes after Gabriel sends the message, the driver of the SUV shoots him dead.
The next step was figuring out who it was that was driving that Trailblazer and who pulled the trigger.
Investigators received the surveillance footage from the ATM at Vision Bank.
The receipt showed the withdrawal of the ATM on September 22nd at 9:04. So I wanted to see who was operating the vehicle at that time. And I start looking at that video. I see a black SUV appearing to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. It pulls right up to the ATM. And that's where you get a good look of the driver withdrawing cash.
Stop.
You can see the stickers in the vehicle that matched the McDonald's video.
I'm gonna rewind this.
Most notably, you can see who's driving. He's dressed in the same clothing that the shooter appeared to be wearing in the McDonald's video.
Here's our shooter.
He's getting that receipt.
That was a pretty big moment in the investigation, but now we needed to identify the driver. When we found the vehicle, there was no license plate, but the vehicle has a vehicle identification number or VIN number. We ran the VIN number of that vehicle, and the VIN number came back to Izetta Cooley.
Check for everyone who lives at that residence.
We start running backgrounds on them to figure out as much as we can. Izetta Cooley was married to Miguel Cooley Sr.
Investigators pull up Miguel's license. The photo is a match for the driver in the ATM footage.
There's no doubt it was Miguel Cooley Sr. driving that vehicle. We've now got a suspect identified. So now we have to go apprehend him. We obtain a search warrant for Miguel Cooley's residence.
Fargo PD, we have a warrant to search your property.
Izetta's home. She was somewhat cooperative, but, you know, kind of standoffish a little bit. She says that Miguel Cooley is not at home. If we don't find Miguel Cooley there himself, the evidence we're looking for is any firearms, particularly a pistol. We found a lot of ammunition, some of it .45 caliber, consistent with what we found at the crime scene. We also come across 3 sets of Chevy keys. That's a significant piece of evidence. Those keys link that vehicle to that residence.
That solidified the connection between Miguel Cooley and this crime.
We request that Izetta turn over her cell phone.
Investigators take Izetta to the police department for questioning.
You do have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can only be used against you in a court of law.
She's interviewed by law enforcement. I remember that being a very bizarre interview.
You can't do this. I'm barely keeping it together as it is. I mean, I can't even breathe. I can't even breathe.
Izetta was not the most cooperative during the interview. She was very vague on a lot of things. I asked her if she was engaging with some sort of romantic relationship with Gabriel Perez.
There was no relationship.
Why did you want to meet with him? His messages read like you two are flirting.
I wasn't having a relationship.
So you were just toying around with him? Or just flirting kind of for fun? Well, then what does it mean?
Izetta Cooley also was maintaining her husband's innocence.
No, I think you're here to incriminate my husband.
I don't know that we can incriminate him more than he's incriminated. The whole shooting's on video.
You guys don't understand. It's not, I'm not talking to you anymore.
Try me.
I'm done.
At the time we're interviewing Izetta, we received a phone call. Authorities in Minnesota have tracked down Miguel Cooley. Miguel Cooley is ultimately located in the Rochester, Minnesota area at his sister and brother-in-law's home. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force were brought in to apprehend Miguel Cooley.
Miguel, give yourself up! Show me your hands! Walk towards me with your hands up!
Miguel Cooley has changed his appearance. He's shaved off his beard.
Stop right there! Turn around. Place your hands behind your back.
The task force arrests Miguel Cooley for the murder of Gabriel Perez.
That was a really big relief for me and my family. It's one step closer to getting Gabriel justice.
I was definitely glad that he got found. But at the same time, it's just like I didn't want to accept the fact that Gabriel was gone. So you know what I mean? I just felt so lost on it.
Miguel Cooley is transferred to the Mower County Jail. Myself and 3 other detectives start conducting interviews. We're trying to narrow down exactly why this occurred. And I was curious as to whether or not Miguel Cooley would tell us anything about why he killed Gabriel Perez.
We're here to talk with you about what's been going on the last few days. Yeah, everything's like blurred.
What pissed you off and got you to the point that Sunday morning happened? Why?
No, I was really drunk. I went to Austin.
Austin, Minnesota?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I went there and wanted to get some tires, but they didn't have any tires at the Walmart there.
All he told us was everything was a blur. He wanted to talk about having a flat tire, so very nondescript, nothing that would rule him out.
He said, I have a defensive training, someone told me I don't know how to get one.
He requested his attorney, so we never spoke any further than that. It can be a little frustrating at times when people don't want to talk, but I mean, that's their right. Around this time, we're able to get into the cell phone data from Izetta's phone.
We can access her texts.
We wanted to know if Izetta was complicit in any way. I see that there's a text message a few hours after the murder. Izetta sent a message to someone close to her. She mentioned that prior to the murder, Miguel ended up going to a restaurant called the Frying Pan to get food.
Investigators head to the restaurant to analyze the surveillance footage for clues.
We don't know exactly when he was at the Frying Pan, but we could start with working back from when he was at McDonald's.
Can you show us 5 a.m. on September 23rd?
Sure enough, Miguel Cooley entered the restaurant at about 5:09 a.m.
The Frying Pan restaurant is within blocks of the McDonald's where Gabe Perez was shot and killed. So the question was, how did Miguel Cooley know that Gabe Perez would be in that McDonald's parking lot? Just minutes later.
Cooley looks like he's ordered food or is waiting for an order.
In the video from the frying pan, you can see Mr. Cooley's wearing the same shirt that he appears to be wearing on both the Vision Bank footage and the McDonald's footage.
Oh, he's really busy on his phone.
So he's within the area of the crime and communicating with someone in the moments before.
We know on the day of the murder, Izetta and Gabriel are exchanging messages. Izetta appears to be asking to meet with Gabriel Perez at the McDonald's. The frying pan video showed Miguel Cooley exiting the business at about 5:16 a.m. Gabriel Perez's last message to Izetta Cooley is at 5:21 a.m. And it just says that he's there at McDonald's. And within minutes, Miguel Cooley Sr. drives up and essentially executes him.
Detectives take a closer look at the Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel.
One of Izetta's messages, she describes what she's going to be wearing, a white t-shirt and gray pants. That message sounds a little suspicious. Gabriel and Izetta know each other. So if you're going to meet up, why do you need to know what they're wearing? But the messages arranging to meet at McDonald's may not have been submitted by Izetta. That was possibly Miguel Cooley Sr. sending those messages from her account. It's starting to make sense. He's luring Gabriel Perez to McDonald's with the intent to kill him.
The person Gabe believed was Izetta Cooley told him to meet her at the McDonald's. The person he met there was clearly not Izetta Cooley. Miguel Cooley could have sent the messages which led Gabe to go to that location. Miguel Cooley baited Gabe Perez to enter that parking lot. Based upon all the evidence collected in this case, we were able to charge Miguel with murder.
On August 22, 2019, Miguel Cooley appears in court and pleads guilty to first-degree murder. At Cooley's sentencing, prosecutors stepped through the events that led to Gabriel's death.
The evidence really showed that Gabriel Perez was engaging in flirtatious texts with Miguel Cooley's wife.
Gabe and Izetta were apparently communicating through Facebook Messenger. Mr. Cooley was aware of these messages, and that's what fueled him in his rage.
You actually suck at this game. What the?
Gabriel and Izetta arranged to meet at McDonald's. Gabriel was directed to go there from Izetta's Facebook account. But I believe Miguel Cooley probably took over her account.
Mr. Cooley knew Gabe Perez would be outside the McDonald's. When Mr. Cooley entered that McDonald's parking lot, he moved with clear intent. He drove directly towards Gabe Perez, stopped, shot him, and left within seconds. He had one reason for being there, and that was to kill Gabe Perez.
On January 13th, 2020, Miguel Cooley is sentenced to 50 years in prison. Izetta Cooley is charged with no crime in relation to Gabriel's murder. There is no evidence that she had any involvement in what happened.
Law enforcement did an exceptional job investigating this case. And part of that was recovering all of the security footage. It was critical for us to prove our charge of murder.
I don't think we'll ever come to terms with losing Gabriel. Losing somebody in general is painful, but losing somebody in the way we lost Gabriel is worse.
Gabriel was one of the most caring people that I knew and that I've ever came across in my life.
The Earth has a terrifying way of holding its breath, guarding secrets in the absolute dark until the ground itself can no longer bear the weight of what has been hidden. It was late October 1988 when the small town of Blackwood, nestled deep in the upstate valley of New York, woke up to a chill that had nothing to do with the changing season. A young woman, just 19 years old, stepped out of her house on a Tuesday evening to drop a letter in the mailbox at the corner of the street. She left the front porch light on, her keys sitting on the kitchen counter, and her favorite cassette tape still resting inside the stereo system of her bedroom. She never returned. In less than 5 minutes, the time it takes for a street lamp to flicker to life against the encroaching dusk, she vanished into the thin, biting mountain air. No screams were heard, no scuffle was recorded on the damp asphalt, and no tracks were left in the fallen leaves that lined the suburban sidewalks. It was a sudden, violent erasure that defied the small-town logic of a community that had lived for generations without locking their front doors. When the family realized the minutes had bled into hours, a frantic, disorganized search erupted across the neighborhood, flashlight beams cutting through the heavy autumn fog like desperate fingers reaching for a ghost. The police arrived, their sirens screaming into the indifferent valley, signaling the birth of a mystery that would freeze the heart of the community for nearly 4 decades. The initial investigation was a chaotic scramble against a ticking clock that was moving far too fast for the primitive forensic tools of the late 1980s. Detectives combed the grid, setting up checkpoints on the state highway, interviewing teenage classmates, local store owners, and truck drivers who had passed through the area during that fateful 5-minute window. They found nothing but a vast, mocking expanse of silence. The mailbox at the corner stood empty, a cold metal sentinel that had witnessed the exact moment a life was stolen but possessed no voice to give up the monster's name. Suspicion settled over the town like a toxic cloud, turning lifelong neighbors into bitter adversaries as everyone looked at everyone else through a lens of profound distrust. Was the predator a stranger passing through on the interstate, or was he the man who delivered the morning paper, the friendly mechanic at the gas station, or the quiet boy who sat in the back of the high school auditorium? The fear was insidious, a slow-acting poison that permanently altered the social landscape of Blackwood. Curfews were established. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone, and the carefree, rural innocence that had defined the valley was buried beneath a thick layer of collective paranoia. As the weeks dragged into months, the intensity of the search began to suffer from the inevitable, cruel erosion of time. The newspaper headlines that had initially screamed of the vanished Valley Girl began to shrink, pushed to the inner pages by local political updates and the rising tide of national news. The family of the missing girl found themselves trapped in a unique, devastating purgatory, a space where grief could not be processed because there was no body to bury, no funeral to hold, and no definitive answer to the suffocating question of what had happened in those dark minutes near the mailbox. They kept her bedroom exactly as it had been on that October night, a dusty, preserved monument to a life suspended in midair. Every ring of the telephone caused their chests to tighten. Every knock at the door brought a wave of blinding adrenaline, only to end in the crushing disappointment of a telemarketer or a neighbor delivering a casserole. The case file in the county sheriff's department grew thick, accumulating hundreds of pages of unverified tips, jailhouse rumors, and descriptions of strange vehicles that ultimately led to dead ends, until it was finally moved out of the active cabinet and into the long-term storage room, a cold case born in the shadow of a forgotten decade. The turn of the millennium brought a change in the architecture of the town, but no relief from the phantom that haunted its history. The original investigators retired, their hair turning gray, their notebooks filled with theories that they carried into their private lives like an unpayable debt. They had checked the woods, dragged the quarry lakes, and looked into the backgrounds of every registered offender within a 50-mile radius, but the killer had moved like smoke through a screen door, leaving no DNA, no fingerprints, and no structural clues. The case became a local legend, a cautionary tale spoken of in hushed tones around campfires or over drinks at the local American Legion post. It was the mystery that defined the region, a permanent question mark etched into the consciousness of Blackwood. Younger generations grew up knowing her face from the faded missing person posters that still clung to the bulletin board at the town hall, a monochrome image of a smiling girl with big 80s hair and hopeful eyes, looking out at a community that had failed to find her. Then came the spring of 2026, a season of sudden, violent transition that would completely shatter 38 years of stagnation. A construction crew working on an expansion of the state highway bypass, roughly 12 miles north of the town center, was operating a heavy excavator near the edge of a deep, rocky ravine that had remained untouched by human hands for over half a century. The steel teeth of the bucket bit into a layer of compacted clay and shale, lifting a mass of earth that contained something completely foreign to the natural geology of the valley. As the dirt spilled back onto the ground, the foreman noticed a glint of synthetic material, a fragment of a canvas sneaker, its blue color preserved by the airtight seal of the dense clay, and beneath it, the unmistakable, terrifying curvature of a human bone. The machinery stopped instantly. The site was cordoned off within 30 minutes, transformed from a noisy construction zone into a sterile, high-security crime scene as forensic teams and anthropologists descended into the ravine. They moved with a quiet, reverent speed, using small hand tools and soft brushes to meticulously peel back the layers of earth that had acted as a secret vault since 1988. What they uncovered was not a shallow, hurried grave, but a deep, natural fissure in the rock where the remains had been deliberately deposited and covered with heavy stones to prevent animal scavenging and detection. The physical trauma on the skeletal structure was immediate and clear, a violent fracture at the base of the skull, indicating a catastrophic, unprovoked blow delivered from behind. The recovery team found more than just bone. They recovered the artifacts of a specific moment in time. A small, rusted metal zipper, fragments of a denim jacket, and a plain silver ring with a distinct, hand-engraved initials on the inner band. The items were placed in sterile evidence bags, rushed under police escort to the State Forensic Pathology Laboratory in Albany. The news of the discovery hit Blackwood like a physical shockwave, the rumors flying through the town with the speed of an electric current. Everyone knew whose name was written in the margins of that ravine. The decades of silence were coming to an end. The earth had finally given up its dead, and the community was about to be forced to look back into the eyes of a monster who had hidden among them for a lifetime. Inside the state laboratory, the process of confirmation was a race against the limits of degraded biological material. The bones had been subjected to nearly 4 decades of moisture, root intrusion, and the chemical variations of the soil, making the extraction of a clean DNA profile an exceptionally delicate operation. Analysts worked in a cleanroom environment, crushing a small fragment of the femur to isolate the ancient genetic material, while detectives tracked down the dental records that had been kept on microfilm in a vault since the initial disappearance. The comparison was an exercise in absolute precision, a matching of numbers and structures that bypassed the distortion of time and memory. On the 3rd day of analysis, the results flared across the computer monitors, a perfect, undeniable match. The remains belonged to the 19-year-old girl who had walked out to the mailbox in October 1988. The formal identification was the hammer blow that demolished the town's fragile equilibrium. The cold case was no longer a missing persons file. It was an active, high-intensity homicide investigation. The sheriff called a press conference, his voice level but strained as he announced the definitive identification to a packed room of national journalists and weeping family members. The mystery of her whereabouts had been solved, but the exposure of her final resting place opened a new, far more dangerous chapter in the story. The location of the ravine was significant. It wasn't a place easily accessible to a stranger passing through on the interstate. It required an intimate knowledge of the old logging trails, the blind spots of the valley, and the specific terrain that only a local hunter or woodsman would possess. The focus of the task force shifted instantly from the victim to the killer, who was now understood to be someone who had lived, worked, and breathed the air of the valley while his victim lay in the dark just 12 miles away. The original list of suspects was pulled from the archives, the yellowed pages of interviews scanned into digital databases, and the alibis given in 1988 subjected to the harsh, unforgiving scrutiny of modern analytical software. The detectives realized they were chasing a man who was now likely in his 60s or 70s, someone who had enjoyed a full life, built a career, and perhaps raised his own children, all while holding the memory of that violent night in the ravine close to his chest. The hunt was no longer a historical inquiry. It was a targeted, scientific pursuit of a living killer who had run out of time. As the community prepared for a funeral that had been delayed for 38 years, the atmosphere in Blackwood returned to the heavy, paranoid tension of 1988. The monster was no longer an abstract concept or a ghost story. He was a real person, a neighbor, a man who might still be sitting next to them at the diner, pumping gas at the station, or watching the news reports with a racing heart. The anger that had been dammed up for a generation was breaking through the surface of the town, a demand for accountability that would not be silenced by the passage of time. The Earth had done its part, the science had provided the key, and now the justice system was closing the distance, preparing to drag the predator out of the shadows of the valley and into the absolute, uncompromising light of the truth. The streaming narration continues without interruption, maintaining the high-voltage urgency and cinematic pacing, flowing directly into the deep dive of the historical suspects, the hidden connections of the logging roads, and the high-tech surveillance used to trap the prime target. The re-examination of the 1988 logbooks began in a secure room at the county seat, where every piece of data from the initial canvas was cross-referenced with modern property records and geographical tracking systems. Homicide investigators didn't look at the files with the eyes of the past. They viewed them through the lens of spatial behavioral analysis, mapping the relationship between the mailbox where she vanished, the route to the state bypass, and the specific, hidden entry points to the ravine. They discovered that in the winter of 1988, the land surrounding the ravine wasn't public property. It was owned by a local timber company that employed a small, specialized crew of clearing contractors. One name stood out on those payroll sheets, a man who had been interviewed twice by the original detectives but dismissed because his employer had verified his presence at an equipment yard miles away during the estimated time of the abduction. That alibi, typed on a faded corporate ledger, was the first brick to be pulled from the wall of the killer's defense. Detectives tracked down the retired yard foreman who had signed that logbook 38 years ago. Now living in a care facility, his memory faded but his conscience clear. He admitted under recorded questioning that the company's logging crews frequently traded shifts without updating the official records, and that the suspect had routinely used company trucks after hours for personal hunting trips in the very sector where the remains were uncovered. The revelation was the spark that ignited the final phase of the manhunt. The shadow was taking on a solid, undeniable form, a genetic and professional profile that converged on a single individual who had never left the county, a man who had transitioned from a rugged woodsman into a quiet, unassuming property owner living on the western ridge of the valley. The tactical units did not rush the target. They initiated a covert surveillance detail that utilized advanced digital tracking and long-range optics, observing the suspect as he went about his morning routine, buying groceries at the same market the victim's family used, sitting on his porch watching the sunset over the valley, living a peaceful, unburdened existence while the machinery of the state was quietly assembling his execution. The contrast was a direct insult to the concept of cosmic justice. A young woman denied her 20s, her 30s, her entire potential, while her killer was allowed to age gracefully in the comfort of the same landscape that witnessed his brutality. The detectives felt the rising tide of that collective fury, an icy, controlled determination to ensure that no procedural errors, no gaps in the chain of evidence, would allow him to escape the reckoning that the Earth had demanded when it surrendered the blue sneaker and the silver ring. The final laboratory report arrived on a Thursday morning, confirming that a microscopic fiber recovered from the denim jacket fragment found in the grave perfectly matched the material composition of an old industrial utility blanket that had been standard issue in the timber company's fleet during the late 80s. It was the physical link that bridged the gap between the logging trails, the truck, the ravine, and the suspect. Armed with a high-priority arrest warrant signed by a state Supreme Court judge, A convoy of 4 unmarked black vehicles moved out from the precinct at dawn, their tires kicking up dust as they climbed the winding gravel road toward the ridge, the blue and red lights remaining dark until they swerved into the suspect's driveway, blocking his exit and sealing his fate before the morning sun could fully clear the valley walls. The arrest was executed with a cold, militaristic efficiency that left no room for drama or resistance. The suspect, a man now 72 years old, with calloused hands and a face lined by decades of mountain winter, was intercepted as he stepped onto his porch with a mug of coffee. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He simply looked at the heavy vests, the badges, and the black muzzles of the weapons pointed at his chest, and let out a long, slow whistle that sounded like air escaping a tire. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound resonated across the quiet valley like the closing of a heavy book that had been left open for too long. The town of Blackwood, after 38 years of carrying the weight of an unsolved horror, was finally handed a name, a face, and a destination for the anger that had defined its history. The processing of the suspect inside the county jail was a masterclass in psychological containment. He was stripped of his civilian clothes, dressed in the bright orange uniform of the state, and led into an interrogation room where the walls were covered not with modern charts, but with the original, black and white photographs of the 19-year-old girl who had walked out to her mailbox and never came home. For 6 hours, he maintained a wall of stubborn, practiced denial, his voice a low gravelly growl as he repeated the same phrases he had used in 1988. But Detective Lynn didn't argue with him. She didn't offer deals or dynamic outbursts. She simply laid the artifacts from the ravine on the table one by one, the zipper, the fiber analysis, the state lab reports, and finally, the silver ring with the hand-engraved initials. The sight of the ring was the definitive blow that broke his reality. His eyes fixated on the scratched metal surface, his breathing turning shallow and irregular as the weight of 38 years of deception finally crushed his resolve. The confession that followed was a quiet, chilling unspooling of pure malice, a description of a chance encounter, a sudden surge of violent impulse, and a calculated, cold-blooded effort to use the vast, uncaring geography of the valley to erase his sin. He had believed that the earth would assimilate her, that the clay and stone would dissolve the truth, and that he could continue to walk the streets of Blackwood as a ghost who had gotten away with the ultimate crime. Outside the jail, the news of the confession shattered the last remnants of the town's paralysis. The community didn't celebrate. They gathered in the central square, a quiet, somber assembly of generations who had been touched by the shadow of 1988. The funeral was held 2 days later, a long, silent procession that wound through the streets, past the mailbox that still stood at the corner, and up to the cemetery on the hill where an empty plot had been waiting for nearly 4 decades. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the rain began to fall over Blackwood, a clean, washing downpour that felt like the universe finally settling a debt, a formal declaration that the search was over, the mystery was gone, and the valley could finally, after the longest and most agonizing of winters, begin the slow, necessary process of letting go. The earth has a terrifying way of holding its breath, guarding secrets in the absolute dark until the ground itself can no longer bear the weight of what has been hidden. It was late October 1988 when the small town of Blackwood, nestled deep in the upstate valley of New York, woke up to a chill that had nothing to do with the changing season. A young woman, just 19 years old, stepped out of her house on a Tuesday evening to drop a letter in the mailbox at the corner of the street. She left the front porch light on, her keys sitting on the kitchen counter, and her favorite cassette tape still resting inside the stereo system of her bedroom. She never returned. In less than 5 minutes, the time it takes for a street lamp to flicker to life against the encroaching dusk, she vanished into the thin, biting mountain air. No screams were heard, no scuffle was recorded on the damp asphalt, and no tracks were left in the fallen leaves that lined the suburban sidewalks. It was a sudden, violent erasure that defied the small-town logic of a community that had lived for generations without locking their front doors. When the family realized the minutes had bled into hours, a frantic, disorganized search erupted across the neighborhood, flashlight beams cutting through the heavy autumn fog like desperate fingers reaching for a ghost. The police arrived, their sirens screaming into the indifferent valley, signaling the birth of a mystery that would freeze the heart of the community for nearly 4 decades. The initial investigation was a chaotic scramble against a ticking clock that was moving far too fast for the primitive forensic tools of the late 1980s. Detectives combed the grid, setting up checkpoints on the state highway, interviewing teenage classmates, local store owners, and truck drivers who had passed through the area during that fateful 5-minute window. They found nothing but a vast, mocking expanse of silence. The mailbox at the corner stood empty, a cold metal sentinel that had witnessed the exact moment a life was stolen but possessed no voice to give up the monster's name. Suspicion settled over the town like a toxic cloud, turning lifelong neighbors into bitter adversaries as everyone looked at everyone else through a lens of profound distrust. Was the predator a stranger passing through on the interstate, or was he the man who delivered the morning paper, the friendly mechanic at the gas station, or the quiet boy who sat in the back of the high school auditorium? The fear was insidious, a slow-acting poison that permanently altered the social landscape of Blackwood. Curfews were established. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone, and the carefree, rural innocence that had defined the valley was buried beneath a thick layer of collective paranoia. As the weeks dragged into months, the intensity of the search began to suffer from the inevitable, cruel erosion of time. The newspaper headlines that had initially screamed of the vanished Valley Girl began to shrink, pushed to the inner pages by local political updates and the rising tide of national news. The family of the missing girl found themselves trapped in unique, devastating purgatory, a space where grief could not be processed because there was no body to bury, no funeral to hold, and no definitive answer to the suffocating question of what had happened in those dark minutes near the mailbox. They kept her bedroom exactly as it had been on that October night, a dusty, preserved monument to a life suspended in midair. Every ring of the telephone caused their chests to tighten. Every knock at the door brought a wave of blinding adrenaline, only to end in the crushing disappointment of a telemarketer or a neighbor delivering a casserole. The case file in the county sheriff's department grew thick, accumulating hundreds of pages of unverified tips, jailhouse rumors, and descriptions of strange vehicles that ultimately led to dead ends, until it was finally moved out of the active cabinet and into the long-term storage room, a cold case born in the shadow of a forgotten decade. The turn of the millennium brought a change in the architecture of the town, but no relief from the phantom that haunted its history. The original investigators retired, their hair turning gray, their notebooks filled with theories that they carried into their private lives like an unpayable debt. They had checked the woods, dragged the quarry lakes, and looked into the backgrounds of every registered offender within a 50-mile radius, but the killer had moved like smoke through a screen door, leaving no DNA, no fingerprints, and no structural clues. The case became a local legend, a cautionary tale spoken of in hushed tones around campfires or over drinks at the local American Legion post. It was the mystery that defined the region, a permanent question mark etched into the consciousness of Blackwood. Younger generations grew up knowing her face from the faded missing person posters that still clung to the bulletin board at the town hall, a monochrome image of a smiling girl with big 80s hair and hopeful eyes, looking out at a community that had failed to find her. Then came the spring of 2026, a season of sudden, violent transition that would completely shatter 38 years of stagnation. A construction crew working on an expansion of the state highway bypass, roughly 12 miles north of the town center, was operating a heavy excavator near the edge of a deep, rocky ravine that had remained untouched by human hands for over half a century. The steel teeth of the bucket bit into a layer of compacted clay and shale, lifting a mass of earth that contained something completely foreign to the natural geology of the valley. As the dirt spilled back onto the ground, the foreman noticed a glint of synthetic material, a fragment of a canvas sneaker, its blue color preserved by the airtight seal of the dense clay, and beneath it, the unmistakable, terrifying curvature of a human bone. The machinery stopped instantly. The site was cordoned off within 30 minutes, transformed from a noisy construction zone into a sterile, high-security crime scene as forensic teams and anthropologists descended into the ravine. They moved with a quiet, reverent speed, using small hand tools and soft brushes to meticulously peel back the layers of earth that had acted as a secret vault since 1988. What they uncovered was not a shallow, hurried grave, but a deep, natural fissure in the rock where the remains had been deliberately deposited and covered with heavy stones to prevent animal scavenging and detection. The physical trauma on the skeletal structure was immediate and clear, a violent fracture at the base of the skull, indicating a catastrophic, unprovoked blow delivered from behind. The recovery team found more than just bone. They recovered the artifacts of a specific moment in time. A small, rusted metal zipper, fragments of a denim jacket, and a plain silver ring with a distinct, hand-engraved initials on the inner band. The items were placed in sterile evidence bags, rushed under police escort to the State Forensic Pathology Laboratory in Albany. The news of the discovery hit Blackwood like a physical shockwave, the rumors flying through the town with the speed of an electric current. Everyone knew whose name was written in the margins of that ravine. The decades of silence were coming to an end. The earth had finally given up its dead, and the community was about to be forced to look back into the eyes of a monster who had hidden among them for a lifetime. Inside the state laboratory, the process of confirmation was a race against the limits of degraded biological material. The bones had been subjected to nearly 4 decades of moisture, root intrusion, and the chemical variations of the soil, making the extraction of a clean DNA profile an exceptionally delicate operation. Analysts worked in a cleanroom environment, crushing a small fragment of the femur to isolate the ancient genetic material, while detectives tracked down the dental records that had been kept on microfilm in a vault since the initial disappearance. The comparison was an exercise in absolute precision, a matching of numbers and structures that bypassed the distortion of time and memory. On the 3rd day of analysis, the results flared across the computer monitors, a perfect, undeniable match. The remains belonged to the 19-year-old girl who had walked out to the mailbox in October 1988. The formal identification was the hammer blow that demolished the town's fragile equilibrium. The cold case was no longer a missing persons file. It was an active, high-intensity homicide investigation. The sheriff called a press conference, his voice level but strained as he announced the definitive identification to a packed room of national journalists and weeping family members. The mystery of her whereabouts had been solved, but the exposure of her final resting place opened a new, far more dangerous chapter in the story. The location of the ravine was significant. It wasn't a place easily accessible to a stranger passing through on the interstate. It required an intimate knowledge of the old logging trails, the blind spots of the valley, and the specific terrain that only a local hunter or woodsman would possess. The focus of the task force shifted instantly from the victim to the killer, who was now understood to be someone who had lived, worked, and breathed the air of the valley, while his victim lay in the dark just 12 miles away. The original list of suspects was pulled from the archives, the yellowed pages of interviews scanned into digital databases, and the alibis given in 1988 subjected to the harsh, unforgiving scrutiny of modern analytical software. The detectives realized they were chasing a man who was now likely in his 60s or 70s, someone who had enjoyed a full life, built a career, and perhaps raised his own children, all while holding the memory of that violent night in the ravine close to his chest. The hunt was no longer a historical inquiry. It was a targeted, scientific pursuit of a living killer who had run out of time. As the community prepared for a funeral that had been delayed for 38 years, the atmosphere in Blackwood returned to the heavy, paranoid tension of 1988. The monster was no longer an abstract concept or a ghost story. He was a real person, a neighbor, a man who might still be sitting next to them at the diner, pumping gas at the station, or watching the news reports with a racing heart. The anger that had been dammed up for a generation was breaking through the surface of the town, a demand for accountability that would not be silenced by the passage of time. The earth had done its part. The science had provided the key, and now the justice system was closing the distance, preparing to drag the predator out of the shadows of the valley and into the absolute, uncompromising light of the truth. The streaming narration continues without interruption, maintaining the high-voltage urgency and cinematic pacing, flowing directly into the deep dive of the historical suspects, the hidden connections of the logging roads, and the high-tech surveillance used to trap the prime target. The re-examination of the 1988 logbooks began in a secure room at the county seat, where every piece of data from the initial canvass was cross-referenced with modern property records and geographical tracking systems. Homicide investigators didn't look at the files with the eyes of the past. They viewed them through the lens of spatial behavioral analysis, mapping the relationship between the mailbox where she vanished, the route to the state bypass, and the specific, hidden entry points to the ravine. They discovered that in the winter of 1988, the land surrounding the ravine wasn't public property. It was owned by a local timber company that employed a small, specialized crew of clearing contractors. One name stood out on those payroll sheets, a man who had been interviewed twice by the original detectives but dismissed because his employer had verified his presence at equipment yard miles away during the estimated time of the abduction. That alibi, typed on a faded corporate ledger, was the first brick to be pulled from the wall of the killer's defense. Detectives tracked down the retired yard foreman who had signed that logbook 38 years ago. Now living in a care facility, his memory faded but his conscience clear. He admitted under recorded questioning that the company's logging crews frequently traded shifts without updating the official records, and that the suspect had routinely used company trucks after hours for personal hunting trips in the very sector where the remains were uncovered. The revelation was the spark that ignited the final phase of the manhunt. The shadow was taking on a solid, undeniable form, a genetic and professional profile that converged on a single individual who had never left the county, a man who had transitioned from a rugged woodsman into a quiet, unassuming property owner living on the western ridge of the valley. The tactical units did not rush the target. They initiated a covert surveillance detail that utilized advanced digital tracking and long-range optics, observing the suspect as he went about his morning routine, buying groceries at the same market the victim's family used, sitting on his porch watching the sunset over the valley, living a peaceful, unburdened existence while the machinery of the state was quietly assembling his execution. The contrast was a direct insult to the concept of cosmic justice. A young woman denied her 20s, her 30s, her entire potential, while her killer was allowed to age gracefully in the comfort of the same landscape that witnessed his brutality. The detectives felt the rising tide of that collective fury, an icy, controlled determination to ensure that no procedural errors, no gaps in the chain of evidence, would allow him to escape the reckoning that the earth had demanded when it surrendered the blue sneaker and the silver ring. The final laboratory report arrived on a Thursday morning, confirming that a microscopic fiber recovered from the denim jacket fragment found in the grave perfectly matched the material composition of an old industrial utility blanket that had been standard issue in the timber company's fleet during the late 80s. It was the physical link that bridged the gap between the logging trails, the truck, the ravine, and the suspect. Armed with a high-priority arrest warrant signed by a state Supreme Court judge, a convoy of 4 unmarked black vehicles moved out from the precinct at dawn, their tires kicking up dust as they climbed the winding gravel road toward the ridge, the blue and red lights remaining dark until they swerved into the suspect's driveway, blocking his exit and sealing his fate before the morning sun could fully clear the valley walls. The arrest was executed with a cold, militaristic efficiency that left no room for drama or resistance. The suspect, a man now 72 years old, with calloused hands and a face lined by decades of mountain winter, was intercepted as he stepped onto his porch with a mug of coffee. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply looked at the heavy vests, the badges, and the black muzzles of the weapons pointed at his chest, and let out a long, slow whistle that sounded like air escaping a tire. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound resonated across the quiet valley, like the closing of a heavy book that had been left open for too long. The town of Blackwood, after 38 years of carrying the weight of an unsolved horror, was finally handed a name, a face, and a destination for the anger that had defined its history. The processing of the suspect inside the county jail was a masterclass in psychological containment. He was stripped of his civilian clothes, dressed in the bright orange uniform of the state, and led into an interrogation room where the walls were covered not with modern charts, but with the original, black and white photographs of the 19-year-old girl who had walked out to her mailbox and never came home. For 6 hours, he maintained a wall of stubborn, practiced denial, his voice a low, gravelly growl as he repeated the same phrases he had used in 1988. But Detective Lynn didn't argue with him. She didn't offer deals or dynamic outbursts. She simply laid the artifacts from the ravine on the table one by one: the zipper, the fiber analysis, the state lab reports, and finally, the silver ring with the hand-engraved initials. The sight of the ring was the definitive blow that broke his reality. His eyes fixated on the scratched metal surface, his breathing turning shallow and irregular as the weight of 38 years of deception finally crushed his resolve. The confession that followed was a quiet, chilling unspooling of pure malice, a description of a chance encounter, a sudden surge of violent impulse, and a calculated, cold-blooded effort to use the vast, uncaring geography of the valley to erase his sin. He had believed that the earth would assimilate her, that the clay and stone would dissolve the truth, and that he could continue to walk the streets of Blackwood as a ghost who had gotten away with the ultimate crime. Outside the jail, the news of the confession shattered the last remnants of the town's paralysis. The community didn't celebrate. They gathered in the central square, a quiet, somber assembly of generations who had been touched by the shadow of 1988. The funeral was held 2 days later, a long, silent procession that wound through the streets, past the mailbox that still stood at the corner, and up to the cemetery on the hill where an empty plot had been waiting for nearly 4 decades. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the rain began to fall over Blackwood, a clean, washing downpour that felt like the universe finally settling a debt, a formal declaration that the search was over, the mystery was gone, and the valley could finally, after the longest and most agonizing of winters, begin the slow, necessary process of letting go. The echo of that rainy afternoon in the Blackwood ravine did not fade. It amplified, reverberating through the wood-paneled offices of the State Forensic Pathology Unit in Albany, where the physical reality of a 38-year-old crime was being systematically disassembled. The cold case, once an abstract phantom that lived only in the deteriorating memories of a scarred community, had transformed into a high-priority forensic operation. Every grain of soil recovered from the deep rock fissure was treated like gold leaf, dried under controlled laboratory conditions, and sifted through microscopic mesh screens to isolate the fragments of identity that the clay had held captive since the autumn of 1988. The skeletal remains lay on an illuminated stainless steel table, a pale, fractured puzzle that demanded an absolute, clinical reconstruction before the legal machinery of the state could move forward with a grand jury indictment. Dr. Elena Vance moved with a fluid, hyper-focused discipline of a scientist who understood that the dead speak in whispers, and that time is a brutal editor that seeks to erase the punctuation marks of violence. Her task was to isolate the blunt force trauma that had shattered the occipital bone at the base of the skull, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the injury was paramatum, inflicted at the exact moment of death, and could not have been caused by the shifting of the tectonic plates or the pressure of the heavy rocks placed over the burial site. Under the high-intensity magnification of the laboratory's digital imagery network, the fracture lines revealed a specific, microscopic truth. The bone had yielded to a dynamic, crushing force delivered with immense mechanical momentum, a trajectory that matched the devastating impact of a heavy iron tire iron or a logging winch handle. While the anthropologists mapped the trauma of the past, the investigative task force was aggressively re-engineering the digital landscape of the suspect's present life. Vincent Moretti was no longer a ghost hiding in the static of 1988. He was a 72-year-old target whose domestic habits were being mapped by advanced behavioral analysis software. The surveillance team, parked in an inconspicuous utility van 300 yards from his ridge property, watched his daily movements through thermal imaging lenses that cut through the thick morning fog of the valley. They saw him wake at 5:45 a.m. They watched the heat signature of his coffee mug rise toward his face. They tracked the slow, arthritic movement of his gait as he stepped out onto the porch to check the mountain wind. To the casual observer, he was a picture of grandfatherly serenity, a retired woodsman who had paid his taxes, minded his business, and earned the right to a quiet, unburdened twilight. But the data flowing into the command center told a completely different story, a narrative of survival built on a foundation of absolute calculation. Lynn spent her nights digging through the timber company's historical logistics, reconstructing the specific fuel logs, maintenance schedules, and equipment distribution sheets from the final week of October 1988. She discovered that the industrial utility blanket, the fiber of which had been found embedded in the rust of the denim jacket fragment, had been checked out to a specific Ford F-250 flatbed truck assigned to the clearing crew on the Western Ridge. The man who had signed for that vehicle, using a faded, blue ballpoint pen that had left an indentation on the carbon copy 3 decades deep, was Vincent Moretti. The immediacy of the forensic connection was a jolt of pure adrenaline to an investigation that had been frozen since the late 80s. The task force knew that the defense would try to claim the blanket fiber was circumstantial, a contaminant introduced during the logging operations that had populated the valley during that era. To counter this strategy, the state laboratory initiated a high-resolution polymer chain reaction test on the biological material recovered from the silver ring found in the grave. The inner band of the ring, where the hand-engraved initials had been protected from the direct acidity of the soil, held a microscopic trace of dried epithelial cells, not from the victim, but from the individual who had violently stripped the jewelry from her finger before depositing her body into the rock fissure. The tension within the precinct house was a living thing, a heavy, electric pressure that mounted with every hour the lab technicians spent running the sequence. Lynn stood by the glass window of the forensics unit, her eyes fixed on the automated sequencing machine as it mapped the base pairs of the ancient DNA. The machine operated with a low, mechanical hum, an indifferent rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from the human agony that had started this journey on a dark Tuesday night in 1988. When the digital readout finally flashed green, signaling a complete, high-resolution match with the genetic profile extracted from the bakery napkin Moretti had discarded in Bay Ridge, the room erupted in a sudden, collective intake of breath. The circle was closed. The forensic architecture was unassailable. The execution of the arrest warrant was scheduled for the following dawn, a tactical decision designed to exploit Moretti's predictable morning routine and minimize the potential for a high-powered rifle standoff on the isolated Ridge Road. The tactical units met in the staging area of an abandoned gravel quarry 5 miles south of the property, their vehicles sitting in the dark with engines idling, the headlights turned off to prevent any visual warning from traveling up the valley. The officers checked their body armor in silence, the sharp click of ammunition magazines seating into tactical rifles the only sound breaking the mountain quiet. Lynn sat in the command vehicle, her fingers tracing the perimeter of the topographical map that displayed the target's escape routes through the old logging trails. "He knows the woods better than any of us," Lynn said over the tactical channel, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence that commanded absolute focus. "If he gets off that porch and into the timberline, we lose our mechanical advantage. We contain him on the gravel driveway before he can reach his threshold. No sirens, no light bars until the perimeter is locked down. We move in 90 seconds. The convoy of 4 unmarked black SUVs moved out from the quarry with a heavy, purposeful momentum, their tires tracking through the frozen mud of the Ridge Road without a whisper of sound. The sky was a pale, pre-dawn gray, the mountain peaks catching the first faint slivers of amber light as the vehicles rounded the final bend and swerved into Moretti's driveway, blocking his truck and boxing him in against the wooden porch steps. Before the dust from the gravel could even settle, 8 tactical officers were on the ground, their weapons raised, their voices breaking the morning silence in a deafening, unified roar. "State Police. Warrant. Don't move, Vincent. Keep your hands where we can see them." Moretti was caught completely exposed, a half-empty mug of coffee in his right hand, a heavy woolen flannel jacket hanging open over his chest. For a fraction of a second, his weight shifted backward, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door of his cabin, his fingers tightening around the handle of the mug as if he were calculating the velocity required to throw the hot liquid into the face of the lead officer. But the precision of the containment was absolute. The red lasers of the tactical sights were already dancing across his chest, a visual confirmation that his decades of unearned freedom had reached an abrupt, violent dead end. He didn't scream, he didn't protest, and he didn't look surprised. He slowly lowered the mug to the porch floor, raised his hands above his silver hair, and allowed the officers to drive him down onto the rough wooden planks, his face pressed against the cold timber, while the steel handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. The sound was sharp, definitive, and final, the acoustic closing of a vault that had remained open for 38 years. As they hoisted him back to his feet, his breathing was slow and regular, his expression a mask of hardened indifference that betrayed absolutely nothing of the terror he had inflicted upon a 19-year-old girl in the very same mountains nearly 4 decades earlier. The ride back down the ridge road was made in complete silence, the silence of a predator who had finally been run to ground and had no words left to defend his survival. The news of the arrest spread through the valley with the speed of an electric current, breaking the long-standing paralysis of the community and drawing hundreds of residents toward the county courthouse where the formal booking was set to take place. They stood along the sidewalks, 3 generations of families who had lived under the shadow of the 1988 cold case, watching in absolute stillness as the black convoy arrived, their blue and red lights finally flaring against the stone facade of the municipal building. Inside the secure cell block, Moretti was processed with the cold, clinical efficiency of a system that had been waiting for him since the late 80s. He was stripped of his boots, his keys, his flannel jacket, and his dignity, dressed in the uniform orange jumpsuit of the state penitentiary, and led into Interrogation Room 3, a windowless box where the walls were covered not in digital projections, but in the original, black and white missing persons flyers and crime scene photographs that Vance had compiled with his own hands before his forced retirement. The images were a physical wall of accusation, the smiling face of the victim from 1988 looking out from the paper with an eternal, unyielding demand for the truth. Lynn entered the room alone, carrying only the small cardboard box that contained the artifacts recovered from the ravine, the blue canvas sneaker fragment, the rusted zipper, and the silver ring with the hand-engraved initials. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the table, looking down at the man who had stolen a lifetime from a family and left a community to rot in a state of perpetual paranoia. She opened the box, her movements slow and deliberate, letting the sound of the cardboard tearing open punctuate the heavy silence of the enclosure. "The Earth didn't want her, Vincent," Lynn said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that filled the room like in physical force. "You thought if you buried her deep enough, if you piled enough shale and limestone over her remains, that the mountains would do the work for you. You thought the soil would dissolve her memory, that the city would build the highway bypass over your sin, and that you could live out your days on that ridge without ever having to look back. But the clay preserved everything. It held onto her jacket, it held onto her shoes, and it held onto your blood on this ring. The hunt is over, Vincent. Your time has run out." Moretti stared at the silver ring sitting on the metal table, his jaw tightening, a small muscle twitching beneath the weathered skin of his temple. For 4 hours, he maintained his wall of stubborn, silent denial, his breath hitching every time Lynn brought up the logistics of the timber company's flatbed truck or the statements of the retired yard foreman. But the physical reality of the artifacts was an unassailable weight, a forensic gravity that was slowly pulling his fortress of lies down into the dirt. The grandfatherly mask he had worn for 38 years was dissolving under the harsh glare of the interrogation lights, exposing the raw, unrepentant calculation of the man who had walked away from the mailbox in October 1988 and never looked back. The breakthrough didn't arrive with a dramatic outburst. It came with a quiet, rattling sigh that seemed to escape from the very bottom of his lungs. Moretti reached forward with his cuffed hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the edge of the evidence tray containing the silver ring. He slowly raised his eyes, looking past the artifacts, straight into Lynn's gaze, his expression shifting from defensive hostility to a profound, hollow exhaustion. "It was raining," Moretti whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like stone grinding against stone. "It was freezing rain, and she was just standing there by the mailbox. I didn't plan it. I didn't go out looking for her. But she saw the truck, she knew who I was, and when I stopped to ask her if she needed a ride up the ridge, she looked at me like I was nothing. like I was just the dirt on the bottom of her shoe. Something inside my head just broke. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about the years. I just wanted to stop her from looking at me that way. The confession poured out over the next 3 hours, a continuous, chilling unspooling of pure, unadulterated malice that left the tracking monitors in the observation deck completely silent. He detailed the mechanics of the abduction, the terrifying speed with which he had forced her into the cab of the F-250, and the long, agonizing drive up the winding logging trails to the isolated sector of the ravine. He described the physical trauma, the use of the tire iron from the truck bed, and the methodical, cold-blooded effort to gather the heavy stones from the creek bed to seal her remains within the rock fissure before the morning clearing crew arrived on site. I went to work the next morning at 7 a.m., Moretti muttered, his face pasty and wet with sweat as the final pieces of the mystery were laid bare. I logged my hours, I drove the tractor, I drank coffee with the foreman. I watched the sheriff's cars cruise past the equipment yard with their sirens screaming, and I didn't feel a thing. I knew if I could just stay baseline normal, if I just kept cutting the timber and didn't leave the county, that the world would eventually get tired of looking. New York is too big, the valleys are too deep, and people have short memories. I thought I had beaten the system. I thought the dirt had swallowed the evidence forever. Lynn didn't offer a word of judgment, keeping her focus locked on the mechanical recording device that was transforming his words into an unassailable legal record. The confession was flawless in its coherence, its logistical details matching the historical terrain maps and the forensic trauma reports with a devastating precision that left absolutely no avenue for an appellate defense or a retraction. The ghost of 1988 had been thoroughly dismantled, his survival strategy exposed as a pathetic, cowardly exercise in domestic camouflage that had finally been shattered by the relentless march of modern science and human endurance. As the booking officers stepped into the room to lead Moretti toward his permanent cell block, the old man stopped at the threshold, turning his head back to look at the black and white photograph of the victim one last time. The unrepentant defiance had completely evaporated, leaving behind only the hollow, pathetic remains of a man who had realized that his entire life was a lie, a 40-year illusion that had vanished into thin air the moment the ground gave up its dead. "What do I tell my daughter?" Moretti asked, his voice cracking with a desperate, self-pitying urgency that Lynn met with an icy, unwavering stare. "Tell her the truth, Vincent," Lynn said, her tone flat and final as she gathered the evidence boxes from the table. "Tell her that you enjoyed 38 years of her life, while the girl from the mailbox spent those decades in the dark of a mountain ravine, waiting for this exact morning to drag you down into the grave with her." The door to the interrogation room slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud, a sound that echoed through the concrete corridors of the courthouse like the final verdict of history. Outside, the rain had begun to fall over the valley, a clean, relentless downpour that washed the gravel driveway of the Ridge property and beat against the cold iron of the mailbox at the corner of the street. The community was gathering in the central square, their faces turned toward the courthouse lights, their silence no longer a weapon of paranoia, but a collective monument of respect for a 19-year-old girl who had finally, through the power of an unyielding truth, forced her way back home. The echo of the steel door slamming in the bowels of the county jail did not signal an ending. It marked the ignition of a massive, bureaucratic machine that began to grind the reality of Vincent Moretti into a permanent legal record. The morning following the confession, the administrative offices of the district attorney resembled a command bunker under active bombardment. The 38-year-old file, once a collection of water-damaged paper and faded ink, had been converted into high-priority digital evidence, its data packets surging across secure networks between Blackwood, Albany, and the state Supreme Court. The immediate challenge was no longer proving who committed the violence, but ensuring that the forensic methodology used to trap the phantom would survive the inevitable, vicious onslaught of a high-stakes appellate defense. Detective Sarah Lynn sat at a long conference table buried beneath columns of property titles, logging manifests from 1988 and high-resolution printouts of the mitochondrial DNA sequencing sheets. Beside her, a team of 3 senior prosecutors dissected Moretti's recorded admission line by line, comparing his gravelly description of the logging trails with historical geological surveys. They had to prove that his knowledge of the ravine was exclusive, that only someone with his specific professional access could have navigated the terrain on that freezing October night. The legal team knew that a confession from a 72-year-old man, no matter how detailed, would be aggressively attacked as coerced, contaminated by media reports, or the product of cognitive decline if it wasn't anchored to unassailable physical data. The geographical reconstruction of the crime scene became the cornerstone of the state's strategy. Lynn worked alongside forensic cartographers who utilized historical aerial photographs taken by the United States Geological Survey in the late 80s. They synchronized these images with modern LiDAR scans of the ravine, creating a three-dimensional digital matrix that stripped away 40 years of forest growth and soil erosion. The rendering revealed a terrifying truth. The specific rock fissure where the remains were uncovered had been part of an active clear-cut sector that was completely closed to the public in October 1988. The timber company had maintained a locked iron gate across the only access road, a gate that Vincent Moretti possessed the keys to open as part of his nocturnal maintenance duties. While the technical team fortified the logistics, the emotional reality of the identification was tearing through the remaining fabric of the Blackwood community. The news that the quiet property owner on the western ridge was the architect of the town's defining horror shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the valley since the arrest. People who had known Moretti for decades, men who had hunted with him, women who had sat next to his wife at church, children who had played with his grandchildren, found themselves reassessing every memory, every conversation, and every friendly gesture through a lens of profound revulsion. The intimacy of his integration into the community was the true shockwave. He hadn't spent the last 38 years hiding in the dark anonymity of a distant metropolis. He had stayed right here, breathing the same mountain air, buying his bread from the same bakers, and watching the family of his victim hollow themselves out with grief while he enjoyed the fruits of an ordinary, peaceful life. The psychological toll on Moretti's immediate family was absolute. The Ridge property, once a symbol of rustic comfort, was now a designated extension of a homicide investigation, cordoned off by yellow police tape that fluttered violently in the cold mountain wind. Surveillance teams remained stationed at the perimeter, not to keep Moretti in, but to protect the family from the gathering crowds of media crews and local residents who stood at the edge of the gravel road, their expressions a mixture of cold fury and morbid curiosity. Moretti's daughter, a woman born years after the disappearance, sat inside the darkened living room, staring at the walls as forensic technicians moved through her father's workshop, tagging old tools, hunting knives, and logging gear that had remained undisturbed since the late 80s. The clean, respectable legacy her father had built for them had vanished overnight, replaced by a legacy of blood, deception, and the chilling realization that the man who had tucked her into bed had carried the secrets of a grave in his heart. In the state laboratory in Albany, the Forensic Anthropology Unit completed its final report on the recovered artifacts. Dr. Elena Vance sat before a high-definition monitor, analyzing the trace elements embedded in the silver ring. The chemical composition of the dark silt that had settled into the hand-engraved initials provided a microscopic timeline of the burial. The soil inside the ring contained high concentrations of specific pine resins and mineral sulfides that were unique to the deepest strata of the ravine, a material signature that could not have been replicated if the body had been moved or deposited at a later date. This data proved that the victim had been placed in the fissure within hours of her disappearance, completely dismantling any potential defense theory that she had been held alive elsewhere or killed by another party before being moved to the highway site. The paperwork for the grand jury indictment was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 38 years to the day since the 19-year-old girl had walked out to the corner mailbox. The timing was an intentional, symbolic choice by the district attorney, a declaration to the community that the passage of time had not diminished the state's obligation to the dead. Lynn stood in the well of the grand jury room, her voice steady and clinical as she presented the multi-layered evidence to 23 local citizens. She didn't utilize emotional appeals. She let the science perform the accusation. She displayed the DNA match percentages, the cartographic overlays of the logging trails, and the physical fragments of the denim jacket, showing how each piece of data locked into the next with the cold, unyielding precision of an industrial press. The grand jury didn't waste time with extended deliberations. Within 30 minutes of Lynn concluding her testimony, the foreman returned a true bill, indicting Vincent Moretti on charges of murder in the second degree, the maximum legal charge available under the New York State Penal Code for a homicide committed in 1988. The indictment was a massive structural victory for the task force, a formal transition from an active investigation to a high-voltage legal prosecution. The trial would take place in the historic county courthouse, the very building where the initial missing persons reports had been filed by a panicked family nearly 4 decades earlier. As the legal battle lines were drawn, the town of Blackwood began the painful, necessary process of preparing for a funeral that had been suspended in midair for a generation. The medical examiner had finally released the remains to the family, allowing them to lift the victim out of the clinical category of cold case and restore her to her proper place within the history of her lineage. The local church, the same building where the community had gathered for candlelit vigils in the dark winter of 1988, opened its doors for a memorial service that drew hundreds of residents from across the valley. The atmosphere was heavy with a solemn, exhausted respect, a shared understanding that they were witnessing more than just a burial. They were witnessing the final, definitive reclamation of a life from the absolute darkness of the unknown. Lynn sat in the back row of the chapel, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket that sat before the altar, surrounded by pale white lilies and old photographs from the late 80s. The images showed a young woman full of life, her laughter caught in the silver halide of a forgotten camera, a stark contrast to the sterile, skeletal reality that had lived on Dr. Vance's laboratory table. Lynn felt the presence of Marcus Vance in the room, his spirit hovering over the assembly through the meticulously kept files and notes he had passed down to her. The old detective had not lived to see the casket, but his stubborn, unyielding refusal to let the file burn had been the engine that drove the science across the finish line. The service concluded with a silent procession up the winding hill toward the municipal cemetery, where a grave had been dug in a plot that had remained vacant since the Nixon administration. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally broke, a steady, washing downpour that beat against the black umbrellas of the mourners and saturated the heavy mountain clay. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the sound of the dirt hitting the wood was a flat, definitive thud that seemed to echo across the entire valley. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had paralyzed Blackwood for 38 years. It was a clean, hollow, and peaceful stillness, the silence that follows the clearing of a long-standing debt, the formal declaration that the search was over, the monster was caged, and the 19-year-old girl from the mailbox was finally, and forever, at rest. Lynn walked back down the hill alone, her trench coat dark with water, her boots tracking the red clay toward her sedan. The case was won, the indictment was secured, and the trial would soon become a matter of public record, but she understood that the true impact of the investigation would remain etched into the emotional geography of the valley for generations to come. They had proven that the truth is a physical anomaly, a persistent, unyielding sequence of genetic data and structural history that cannot be dissolved by the soil, buried by concrete, or erased by the collective amnesia of a changing world. The cold case of 1988 had been shattered into 1,000 pieces of unassailable proof, leaving behind a legacy of light that would continue to shine across the mountains, a beacon of hope for every family still waiting in the dark for an ending that they so rightfully and so desperately deserved. The echo of the dirt hitting the wooden casket on the hill of Blackwood had barely dissipated when the legal warfare shifted its center of gravity back to the county seat. Vincent Moretti's defense team, newly reinforced by a high-profile constitutional litigator from New York City, filed a massive, 70-page motion to dismiss the indictment on Tuesday morning. They weren't playing a game of emotional mitigation anymore. They were attacking the structural integrity of the state's evidence, launching a predatory strike against the very heart of the investigative genetic genealogy used by Detective Sarah Lynn. The court battle promised to be a violent, Modern confrontation over the boundaries of genetic privacy, a high-stakes legal drama that would decide whether a 38-year-old murder could be washed away by the technicalities of the digital age. Inside the secure administrative complex, Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake stood before a wall of historical precedent, her expression a mask of cold, analytical determination. She knew that the defense's primary objective was to suppress the DNA profile extracted from the bakery napkin. If they could convince the judge that the surveillance team's surreptitious retrieval of Moretti's discarded espresso cup constituted an illegal, warrantless search under the Fourth Amendment, the entire legal architecture of the prosecution would collapse. The confession, the forensic identification of the remains, and the subsequent recovery of the artifacts from the ravine would be declared the fruit of the poisonous tree, erased from the record as if they had never existed. The defense's motion was an exercise in sophisticated legal terror, designed to rattle the county court and force an appellate delay. Richard Sterling, the lead defense counsel, held a televised press conference on the steps of the courthouse, his voice carrying a booming, practiced authority that commanded the absolute attention of the national media crews crowding Foley Square. He didn't speak about the murder, the logging trails, or the 19-year-old girl who had vanished from the mailbox. He spoke about the future of civil liberties, spinning a narrative of an omnipotent state surveillance system that could weaponize a citizen's discarded trash against their own family lineage. What happened in this county 38 years ago was an undeniable tragedy, Sterling declared, his tailored dark suit contrasting sharply with the weathered stone of the municipal building behind him. But what the state police are attempting to do today is a tragedy of a different order. They are asking this court to legitimize a radical, unregulated expansion of police power. They are arguing that because a man buys a cup of coffee in a public bakery, the government has the right to seize his biological identity, map his entire family tree without judicial oversight, and tear down his life based on a microscopic trace of degraded data. If this warrantless intrusion is allowed to stand, if we accept that our very DNA is public property the moment we step outside our homes, then privacy in this state is a dead concept. We are putting the future of every citizen on trial. Inside the precinct, Lynn and her task force ignored the media circus, focusing their energy on constructing an unassailable legal counteroffensive. They spent 72 hours straight locked in the Special Victims Bureau conference room, analyzing the legal mechanics of abandoned property. The assistant district attorney did not rely on emotional rhetoric. She anchored her arguments in the established, ironclad principles of constitutional law. Blake pulled files from landmark Supreme Court decisions, tracing the history of the abandonment doctrine from the early 20th century to the modern digital era, proving that when an individual drops an item into a public waste bin or leaves it behind on a commercial table, they explicitly relinquish any reasonable expectation of privacy regarding that object. The evidentiary hearing was set for a freezing morning in mid-June, a season when the mountain valley should have been warm, but a sudden northern front had trapped the county seat in a gray, biting fog that felt entirely appropriate for the grim reality of the proceedings. Courtroom 302 was packed to maximum capacity, the wooden gallery filled with a hyper-vigilant audience of local residents, legal scholars, and journalists who sat in absolute silence as the judge took his place at the bench. Vincent Moretti sat at the defense table, his appearance carefully managed by his attorneys. He wore a soft cream-colored cardigan over a collared shirt, his silver hair neatly parted, looking every inch the fragile, gentle senior citizen who had spent his life building birdhouses rather than clearing logging trails with an tire iron. Sterling took the podium first, his cross-examination of Detective Sarah Lynn designed to expose a procedural flaw or an element of personal bias that could compromise the integrity of the surveillance operation. He leaned over the rail of the witness stand, his demeanor a calculated mix of aggressive skepticism and condescending charm. "Detective Lynn," Sterling began, his eyes locking with hers, "when you followed my client into that bakery on the morning of February 12th, did you possess a search warrant signed by a neutral, detached magistrate?" "No," Lynn replied instantly, her voice level, clinical, and completely devoid of hesitation. "A warrant was not required for the collection of abandoned property in a public space." "Abandoned property?" Sterling scoffed, a mocking smile flaring across his face as he turned toward the jury box. "Let's look at the mechanics of that morning, Detective. My client did not throw that napkin on the floor. He did not drop it in the street. He left it inside a ceramic cup on a table within a private commercial establishment where he was a paying customer. You didn't wait for the busboy to clear the table. You didn't wait for the trash to be moved to the curb. You stepped into that space and seized his genetic material while the seat was still warm. Is that your definition of abandonment, or is it a calculated evasion of the warrant requirement?" Mr. Moretti crumpled the napkin, placed it inside the empty cup, stood up, and exited the building. Lynn stated, her expression flat, her professional focus unyielding under the pressure of his stance. He left the item behind with no intention of returning to retrieve it. Under New York State statutory law, that action constitutes an explicit relinquishment of ownership. The underlying biological material was a component of an abandoned item, and its collection was executed in strict accordance with standard operating procedures for cold case DNA recovery. Sterling spent 2 hours attempting to rattle her, dissecting the chain of custody for the napkin, questioning the calibration of the extraction equipment at the state laboratory, and arguing that the mitochondrial sequencing software was an experimental, unreliable tool that had no place in a capital murder trial. But Lynn remained immovable, her responses short, precise, and entirely anchored in data. She didn't offer opinions. She spoke in dates, times, lab protocols, and statistical certainties, her testimony reflecting the objective, unyielding nature of the science that had brought the ghost of 1988 to his knees. When Catherine Blake stood up to deliver the state's oral argument, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She didn't pace the well. She stood dead center, facing the bench, her voice a sharp, rhythmic instrument that cut through the defense's philosophical smoke screen like a scalpel through tissue. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to create a constitutional crisis to protect a killer from the consequences of his own choices," Blake stated, her gaze unwavering. "They want this court to believe that the advancement of science has somehow altered the definition of the law. But the law remains a static, unshakable boundary. Vincent Moretti did not have a privacy interest in his trash in 1988, and he does not have a privacy interest in his trash in 2026. He left his genetic signature on the body of a 19-year-old girl when he murdered her in that ravine, and he left his genetic signature on a piece of paper when he finished his coffee in Brooklyn. Law enforcement utilized the data he discarded to resolve an issue that has paralyzed this community for 38 years. To suppress this evidence would be to declare that time is a shield for the guilty and that a predator who manages to stay hidden long enough can use the Constitution as a weapon to silence his victims from beyond the grave. The judge, a veteran jurist known for his rigorous, conservative adherence to statutory law, listened to the arguments without a single interruption, his face an unreadable mask as he took notes in a thick leather binder. When the presentations concluded, he did not recess the court. He leaned forward over the high wooden bench, looked down at Vincent Moretti for a long, suffocating minute, and began reading his decision directly into the record. The court finds that the defendant's actions on the morning of February 12th satisfied the legal criteria for abandonment, the judge declared, his voice echoing off the plastered walls of the chamber. The collection of the biological sample was executed in a public space without a breach of the defendant's possessory rights. Furthermore, the utilization of investigative genetic genealogy as an analytical lead is an extension of standard public record verification and does not violate the constitutional boundaries of the Fourth Amendment. The defense's motion to suppress the DNA profile, the confession, and the secondary recovery of artifacts is denied in its entirety. The evidence will stand. This case will proceed to trial. A collective, muffled gasp rose from the prosecution's section, a sound of immense, overwhelming relief from the victim's family members, who sat with their hands clutched together in the front row. Opposite them, Moretti's wife lowered her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, devastating grief as the final legal wall protecting her family from the reality of the crime was completely demolished. Moretti himself didn't move, his head dropped slightly lower toward his chest, his cuffed hands tightening around his cardigan as the legal track locked him into a direct, unavoidable trajectory toward a public reckoning in the New York State Supreme Court. Lynn walked out of the courthouse steps into the gray afternoon air, the cold fog hitting her face like a physical slap. The news vans were already broadcasting live updates, the anchors shouting into their microphones as the details of the judge's ruling filtered out across the state. The pretrial battle was won, the forensic foundation was secure, and the ghost of 1988 was officially stripped of his legal defense. The hunt was transitioning from a silent, scientific pursuit into an open, public exposure of a tragedy, a trial where the voice of the 19-year-old girl from the mailbox would finally be amplified through the unassailable weight of the truth, and where the valley would finally see the monster who had lived among them brought to his absolute, definitive knees. The demolition of the defense's motion to suppress sent an immediate, icy tremor through the legal representation of Vincent Moretti. By the third week of June, the bureaucratic engine of the state Supreme Court had shifted its gears from abstract pretrial maneuvers into the high-voltage preparation for jury selection. The county courthouse on Main Street, a stone fortress built at the turn of the 20th century, found itself transformed into the epicenter of a national media storm. Satellite trucks lined the curbs, their thick black cables snaking across the concrete like exposed nerves, while journalists from every major network crowded the steps, their voices merging into a constant, low-frequency buzz that drowned out the ordinary sounds of the mountain valley. Inside the prosecution's war room, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of celebration. Detective Sarah Lynn sat at the center of a long table strewn with the physical remnants of a 38-year-old nightmare. Around her sat 3 senior prosecutors, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights, their eyes scanning the columns of jury questionnaires that had been returned by over 300 local citizens. In a small community like Blackwood, finding 12 individuals who hadn't been psychologically marked by the 1988 disappearance was an almost impossible task. Everyone had a theory. Everyone remembered the terror that had paralyzed the valley when the 19-year-old girl vanished from the mailbox, and everyone had an opinion on the quiet, silver-haired woodsman who had hidden his sin beneath the floorboards of his ridge property for nearly 4 decades. The selection process was a grueling, psychological chess match that lasted for 4 straight days. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake managed the well of the courtroom with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She watched the facial expressions of every potential juror as they were asked about their familiarity with investigative genetic genealogy, their perceptions of DNA abandonment, and their ability to separate the frail, grandfatherly appearance of the defendant from the raw, mechanical brutality detailed in his recorded confession. Richard Sterling, the lead defense counsel, countered every move with aggressive theatricality, trying to seat jurors who expressed skepticism toward modern surveillance methods or who appeared overly sympathetic to the toll that an active prosecution takes on an elderly suspect's family. By Friday afternoon, the panel was locked in, 7 men and 5 women, a diverse cross-section of the valley that included an orchard manager, a retired high school biology teacher, a regional utility worker, and 2 young commuters who had borne long after the initial sirens had faded from the mountain air. They were led into the jury box, their expressions solemn, their eyes tracking the physical reality of courtroom 302, a space that smelled of old varnish, institutional floor wax, and the damp, metallic humidity of the impending summer storms. When the judge called for opening statements on Monday morning, the gallery was packed to its legal capacity, the silence so profound that the rhythmic clicking of the court stenographer's machine sounded like a series of sharp twigs snapping in a dark forest. In the front row of the prosecution's side sat the victim's family, their bodies rigid, their faces mapped with the scars of a 38-year grief that had never been allowed to heal. Across the narrow aisle sat Moretti's wife and daughter, their heads bowed, their isolation absolute, as they were forced to sit in the same room with the man who had traded his family's legacy for a moment of unchecked darkness in October 1988. Blake rose from the prosecution's table, adjusted her jacket, and walked slowly toward the jury box. She didn't utilize digital slides or complex forensic charts for her opening. She understood that the true strength of her case lay in the stark, unvarnished simplicity of the timeline. She leaned against the wooden rail of the box, her eyes locking onto the foreman, her voice carrying a clear, rhythmic authority that instantly commanded the room. "May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury," Blake began, her words dropping into the quiet chamber like stones into a still pool. On the evening of October 25th, 1988, a young woman walked out of the front door of her home. She was 19 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, a life filled with the mundane, beautiful potential that every one of us takes for granted. She walked down to the corner mailbox to drop a letter. It was a journey of less than 50 yards. She left the porch light on. She left her keys on the counter. She expected to return in 3 minutes. Blake's tone dropped, becoming lower, sharper, and heavier with the gravity of the accusation. But she never walked back up those porch steps. In less than 5 minutes, she was violently erased from this community. She was forced into the cab of an industrial flatbed truck by a 24-year-old clearing contractor who possessed an intimate, predatory knowledge of these mountains. For 38 years, this town carried the weight of that disappearance. For 38 years, her family lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing winter, haunted by the absolute silence of the unknown. And for 38 years, the man who caused that agony lived a life of unearned safety on the western ridge of this very valley. A man named Vincent Moretti. She walked across the well, her hand rising to point directly at the defendant, who sat motionless at his table, his eyes fixed on his clasped hands. The defense will ask you to look at the old man sitting before you today. They will ask you to see a gentle grandfather, a peaceful neighbor, a man who has spent his life building a reputation for quiet dependability. But the state will ask you to look past that mask. We will show you the physical evidence that the earth itself preserved in the dark of that mountain ravine. We will show you the DNA match that proves with mathematical certainty that the blood on the victim's silver ring belongs to the man in that chair. And most importantly, we will let you listen to his own voice, describing the specific, mechanical precision with which he used an tire iron to strike down a 19-year-old girl because she refused to look at him. The opening statement was a devastating, clinical strike that left the defense with virtually no room for maneuver. When Richard Sterling stood up to deliver his opening, his demeanor was no longer characterized by the booming, confident charm he had displayed before the television cameras. He was a man fighting from within a fortified perimeter that was rapidly shrinking around his client. He could no longer contest the scientific identification of the remains, nor could he deny Moretti's presence on the logging trails. The pretrial rulings had stripped those weapons from his arsenal. Instead, he attempted to pivot to a strategy of extreme psychological mitigation, trying to introduce a sliver of doubt regarding the intent and the structural premeditation of the crime. "Members of the jury," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a conversational, almost confidential register as he stood before the box. "The prosecution has given you a narrative of a calculating monster, a phantom who stalked these valleys with cold-blooded efficiency. But the reality you will confront over the next few weeks is not a spreadsheet of genetic data. It is a story of human fracture, of a sudden, chaotic panic that exploded in the dark of a mountain road nearly 40 years ago. In 1989, Vincent Moretti was not a master criminal. He was a 24-year-old laborer working 80 hours a week in the isolated timberlines, suffering from severe, undiagnosed psychological strain. What happened that night was a terrible, tragic accident, a sudden flash of confusion that went horribly wrong. The man who sits before you today has spent 38 years living a life of absolute penance, a life defined by peace, by devotion to his family, and by a quiet submission to the order of his community. We ask you not to destroy his family today to satisfy a clinical demand for vengeance from a long-forgotten decade." The presentation of the state's evidence began on Tuesday morning, moving with the heavy, unassailable momentum of a high-priority machine. Blake did not jump immediately to the high-tech genetics. She built the physical architecture of the crime scene first, establishing the baseline geographical reality of the valley in 1988. The first witness called to the stand was the retired county surveyor who had mapped the logging roads for the timber company during the late 80s. Using historical maps projected onto a massive screen above the witness stand, he demonstrated how the specific ravine sector where the remains were uncovered was entirely inaccessible to the public, protected by a network of steep terrain and a locked iron gate. Who had access to that sector in October 1988? Blake asked, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Only the clearing crews, the surveyor replied, his voice clear and objective. Specifically, the night maintenance drivers who were tasked with clearing rockfalls from the paths before the morning shift arrived. They were the only individuals with the keys to that gate. The next witness was the construction foreman who had operated the excavator during the highway bypass expansion in February 2026. He stood on the stand, his boots squeaking slightly against the linoleum, his voice trembling with a lingering, visceral shock as he described the moment the steel bucket bit into the clay, revealing the blue canvas sneaker fragment and the sharp, terrifying curvature of a human bone. His testimony provided the vital, material connection between the historical files and the modern reality, forcing the jury to confront the fact that the crime had remained anchored in the geography of their lives, waiting just 12 miles north for nearly 40 years. For Sarah Lynn, sitting at the prosecution table, the trial was a masterclass in the patience required for systemic justice. She watched the faces of the jurors as the physical artifacts were introduced into evidence, the rusted metal zipper, the denim jacket fragments, and, finally, the small plastic tray containing the silver ring with the hand-engraved initials. The room held its collective breath as Dr. Elena Vance took the stand, her demeanor that of a precise, immovable academic as she explained the high-resolution digital scans of the blunt force trauma at the base of the skull. The fracture lines indicate a catastrophic, mechanical impact delivered with immense force from behind, Dr. Vance stated, pointing to the digital reconstruction on the screen. The bone density and the structural reaction prove that this injury occurred perimortem, at the exact moment of death. It is entirely consistent with an impact from a solid, iron instrument, such as an industrial tire iron. There is no evidence of post-mortem animal activity or geological distortion that could replicate these specific structural fractures. The accumulation of data was an unyielding weight that grew heavier with every hour of testimony. The defense attempted to cross-examine Dr. Vance, suggesting that the acidity of the soil could have distorted the bone structure or created false fracture lines over 38 years, but the anthropologist dismantled the theory with a flurry of chemical data and historical statistics that left Sterling standing in silence at the podium. The science was a locked door, and the state possessed every key. The true climax of the state's case arrived on Thursday morning, when the prosecution moved to introduce the audio recording of Vincent Moretti's confession. The courtroom lights were lowered, the large monitors displaying only a static image of the county jail's interrogation block. Lynn watched the jurors lean forward, their expressions tightening as the low, gravelly rasp of Moretti's voice began to fill the silent chamber. The recording was pristine, every ragged breath, every dry intake of air, and every sharp, metallic click of the handcuff chains amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system. The voice did not sound like the frail old man in the cream cardigan. It carried the cold, unyielding cadence of the predator who had walked away from the ravine in 1988. On the tape, Moretti detailed the mechanics of the abduction, his words completely devoid of emotional inflection as he described the drive up the mountain logging trails. She wouldn't stop crying. She kept looking at me like I wasn't human. I just reached behind the seat and grabbed the iron. I didn't think about it. I just hit her until she was quiet. The raw, brutal simplicity of the admission struck the courtroom like a physical blow. A muffled sob broke from the front row of the gallery where the victim's mother sat, her head buried in her hands, her body shaking with a grief that had been dragged back into the light after nearly 4 decades. The jurors looked away from the monitors, their eyes turning slowly toward Vincent Moretti. The grandfatherly mask had been completely demolished by his own words. The sweater, the silver hair, the submissive posture, all of it was exposed as a pathetic, calculated exercise in domestic camouflage. In that moment, the true nature of the cold case was revealed to the 12 ordinary citizens in the box. It wasn't a historical mystery to be analyzed with detached curiosity. It was a violent, open wound that demanded a definitive, uncompromising resolution. When the tape finally reached its conclusion, the silence that followed was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. The prosecution team allowed that silence to hang over the courtroom for a full minute, letting the reality of the confession settle into the marrow of the jury's consciousness before the judge finally called for the afternoon recess. Lynn stood up, her uniform damp with sweat, her mind turning over the final stretch of the trial, when the geneticists would take the stand to close the scientific loop. The track was clear, the architecture was secure, and the ghost of 1988 had finally run out of runway, his decades of unearned silence about to be permanently answered by the thunderous, inevitable roar of the truth. The second week of the trial inside courtroom 302 began with the sky outside turning the color of bruised iron, a massive summer system rolling over the mountain ridges and trapping the county seat of Blackwood in a humid, electrical darkness. The internal climate of the chamber remained artificially cold, the low hum of the ventilation system providing a constant, mechanical undertone to the high-stakes presentation of the state's forensic centerpiece. Detective Sarah Lynn sat at the prosecution table, her eyes tracking the movements of the state's lead geneticist, Dr. Eris Thorne, as he took his place on the witness stand. This was the moment the trial transitioned from the physical geography of the valley to the invisible, molecular battlefield that would ultimately decide the fate of Vincent Moretti. Dr. Thorne, a precise, sharp-featured man with a manner that exuded the objective confidence of an absolute authority, adjusted the microphone before him. On the massive projection screens hanging above the jury box, the historical maps of the logging trails were replaced by a dense, blinding matrix of genetic code. Short tandem repeat, STR, charts, electropherograms displaying sharp, multicolored peaks, and complex ancestral lineage maps filled the digital space, turning the historic, wood-paneled courtroom into a high-resolution laboratory. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake walked slowly toward the well, her movements deliberate, her focus entirely locked onto the witness. She understood that while the confession had established the emotional reality of the crime, the DNA evidence was the structural anchor that would prevent any future appellate manipulation by the defense. Dr. Thorne, Blake began, her voice crisp and echoing off the vaulted ceilings, let us look at the evidence recovered from the inner band of the silver ring found in the mountain ravine. Can you explain to the jury what biological material was isolated from that artifact? Certainly, Dr. Thorne replied, his cadence level, clinical, and completely accessible to the 12 ordinary citizens in the box. Using high-sensitivity vacuum-assisted swabbing protocols, we managed to harvest a microscopic sample of degraded epithelial cells, skin cells, that had been trapped beneath the dirt crust of the ring's interior engraving. Despite the 38-year duration of environmental exposure, the airtight seal created by the compacted mountain clay and the structural preservation of the heavy stones over the grave protected the sample from total hydrolytic degradation. He pointed to a digital slide displaying a sequence of base pair numbers. We subjected this sample to advanced next-generation sequencing. What we recovered was a complete, high-definition male profile. When this unknown profile was run through investigative genetic genealogy networks, it initiated a precise familial trajectory that led our team directly to the Moretti lineage. But the definitive confirmation came when we compared this ancient profile to the modern biological material recovered from the bakery napkin discarded by the defendant in February 2026. Blake leaned against the railing of the jury box, her eyes fixed on the geneticist. And what were the results of that direct comparison, Doctor? They were identical, Dr. Thorne stated, his words dropping into the silent room with the flat, unassailable weight of a closing vault door. The 13 core Cody's loci, along with 24 auxiliary genetic markers, matched perfectly. The statistical probability of this genetic configuration belonging to any other individual in the Caucasian population is calculated as 1 in 742 trillion. It is a mathematical impossibility for the sample on that ring to have originated from anyone other than the defendant, Vincent Moretti. The announcement was a physical blow to the defense table. Richard Sterling did not look up from his legal pad, his pen tracing jagged, nervous lines across the yellow paper, while Moretti remained entirely static, his silver head bowed so low his chin nearly touched the collar of his cardigan. The grandfatherly illusion had been entirely stripped of its defensive utility. The numbers on the screen were a permanent, unerasable signature written in the blood and skin of his own body, an indictment that had survived 40 years of environmental shifting to expose his sin in the light of day. When Sterling stood up to conduct the cross-examination, his demeanor was no longer characterized by the booming, confident theatricality of the trial's early days. He was a litigator operating from within a completely collapsed perimeter, attempting to find a microscopic procedural flaw in a fortress of empirical science. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, his hands buried deep in his trousers pockets, his expression a mask of manufactured skepticism. "Dr. Thorne," Sterling began, his voice dropping into a sharp, confrontational register, "you speak of trillions and mathematical certainties as if your laboratory operates in a vacuum. But let us discuss the reality of the New York State Forensic Facility in Albany. Is it not true that the extraction equipment used to analyze the napkin sample was the exact same system that underwent a software calibration patch just 48 hours before this analysis was conducted?" "That is correct," Dr. Thorne replied, completely unfazed by the aggressive posture of the attorney. "It was a standard, routine update mandated by federal forensic oversight bodies to increase the sensitivity threshold for low copy number DNA profiles." "An update," Sterling scoffed, turning toward the jury box with a sharp, derisive smile. "An update to a system that handles the biological identity of a citizen facing a charge of capital murder. Can you stand before this jury, doctor, and swear under oath that this newly modified, experimental software did not generate an algorithmic artifact, a digital ghost, that artificially aligned my client's modern DNA with a heavily degraded, contaminated sample taken from a muddy trench?" "The software does not generate ghosts, Mr. Sterling," Dr. Thorne answered instantly, his tone sharpening with a cold, academic authority that completely cut through the defense's rhetoric. "The calibration patch addresses the processing speed of the automated sequencing cameras. It does not alter the physical sequence of the base pairs. The matching loci are structural realities, physical chemical bonds that exist on the material evidence. The software merely records what is there. Your client's genetic code was on that ring in 1988, and it was on that napkin in 2026. No amount of software updates can invent a profile that matches at 37 distinct genetic markers by chance." Sterling spent the next 3 hours attempting to dismantle the chain of custody, arguing that the surveillance officers had contaminated the espresso cup when they retrieved it from the bakery table, and that the victim's denim jacket had been exposed to the biological material of logging workers during the timber operations of the late 80s. But the strategy was a failure. Every theoretical loophole Sterling tried to construct was systematically closed by Thorne with a barrage of contamination log sheets, cleanroom, transport records, and chemical degradation data that left the defense standing in total, frustrated silence at the podium. For Detective Sarah Lynn, watching from the prosecution table, the scientific testimony felt like the final locking of a sequence of heavy iron gates around the suspect. She watched the faces of the jurors as they took notes, their expressions intense, analytical, and entirely devoid of the confusion that Sterling was desperately trying to induce. The 7 men and 5 women in the box were modern citizens. They understood the unyielding nature of genetic data, and they were treating the digital charts not as an abstract concept, but as the physical remains of an absolute truth. The state rested its case on Friday afternoon, exactly 10 days after the first opening statement had broken the silence of courtroom 302. The final piece of evidence introduced was not a chart or an artifact, but a simple, high-resolution color photograph of the corner mailbox on the night of October 25, 1988, the pale yellow light of the street lamp casting a long, solitary shadow across the empty pavement where a 19-year-old girl had taken her final, unhindered steps. It was a silent, devastating monument to the vacuum that Moretti had left behind, a visual reminder that the trial was not about forensic technology or legal doctrines, but about the violent, permanent theft of a human life. The defense's presentation, which began on Monday morning, was a short, desperate exercise in character mitigation that carried the distinct scent of a defeat already accepted. Sterling did not call Vincent Moretti to the stand to expose the 72-year-old defendant to a ruthless, clinical cross-examination by Catherine Blake would have been legal suicide. Instead, they called a succession of character witnesses, a retired contractor who had worked with Moretti in the 90s, a neighbor from Bay Ridge who described his willingness to clear snow from the sidewalks during winter storms, and his daughter, who stood on the stand with her head bowed, her voice breaking into a high, panicked sob as she tried to describe the loving, protective father who had raised her. The emotional display was agonizing to witness, but it carried absolutely no legal weight against the crushing gravity of the state's forensic architecture. During her cross-examinations, Blake did not attack the character witnesses. She treated them with a cold, polite detachment that underscored their total irrelevance to the issue at hand. "Mr. Davis," Blake asked the retired contractor, her voice level and flat, "were you present in the mountain ravine on the night of October 25, 1988? "No," the witness whispered, looking down at his hands. "Did you observe the defendant utilize an tire iron to strike the occipital bone of a 19-year-old girl?" "No." "Then you cannot speak to what lived behind the eyes of Vincent Moretti when the darkness fell over that ridge road, can you?" "No, ma'am." The defense rested by Tuesday afternoon, leaving the courtroom suspended in a state of high-octane anticipation as the judge called for a brief recess before closing arguments. Lynn walked out into the corridor, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt from the storms that were still beating against the high, arched windows. The news vans were crowded along the curb below, their satellite dishes pointed toward the gray sky like metallic flowers, their reporters delivering live updates to a nation that was waiting for the final, definitive tolling of the bell. The hunt had been long, the waiting had lasted for nearly 4 decades, and the road had led through the deepest valleys of the human heart. But as she looked back through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 302, she knew that the distance between the crime and the punishment had finally been reduced to zero. The ghost of 1988 was officially cornered, his decades of unearned silence about to be permanently shattered by the final, thunderous verdict of the law.